So, da sind wir wieder. Einen wunderschönen guten Abend hier im LVR-Landesmuseum in Bonn. Dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome you to this year's Hermann Schaaffhausen lecture. This lecture series was established in 2006. It's dedicated to the Bonn anatomist and prehistorian Professor Hermann Schaaffhausen. He was the first who researched the most important find in our museum, the skeleton of the Neanderthal type specimen, the first recognized Neanderthal, discovered in the Neander Valley 1856. 20 years later, Schaaffhausen made a purchase of the fossil possible with a generous donation. The topic of Neanderthals and the question of the disappearance of these once so successful Ice Age hunters led directly to this evening's speaker, Professor Jean-Jacques Hublin. Jean-Jacques Hublin is holder of the chair of Paläoanthropology at the Collège de France in Paris and Director Emeritus of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. He is one of the leading experts in the field of paleoanthropology. The scientific highlights of his career include the discovery of early forms of Homo sapiens in Morocco in 2017, when he and his local colleagues found the oldest remains of our own species. His scientific work also includes research into growth rhythms and brain development in hominids. He also led a project to digitize fossil human remains. This resulted in an extensive virtual database that is available for researchers worldwide. In addition, he has focused on the interactions between Neanderthals and modern humans, and this is one of the most thrilling stories in archaeology ever. Dear Jean-Jacques, for 2 decades you have also made an important contribution to research into our Neanderthal, which is presented upstairs, and the Ice Age double burial from Bonn-Oberkassel. My personal thanks go to you for this fine cooperation. Professor Hublin has taught at the University of California, Berkeley, Harvard University, Stanford University, and since 2010 at Leiden University. He's a member of numerous scientific societies, including the American Association of Biological Anthropology and the European Society for the Study of Human Evolution. It was a nice meeting in Zagreb. Last year, he was honored with the Belsen Prize. He has enormously enriched our science with hundreds of scientific publications. A few words about the event. We will first listen to Professor Hublin's presentation, which will also be broadcast as a live stream in the YouTube channel of the LVR-Landesmuseum. Participants in a live stream can ask questions at any time during the talk, and we will collect the questions for the questions and answer session after the lecture. After the lecture, there will also be an opportunity to ask questions here in the room. And not to forget, beforehand, before we have questions and answers, the speaker receives a personal gift that only the speakers in this lecture series receive. Dear Jean-Jacques, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Ralph, for these nice words of introduction and these kind of compliments. And thank you, all of you, for being here tonight to listen to me. I'm very honored, of course, to be invited in Bonn for this special lecture. And today what I would like to discuss with you is one of the topics that Ralph highlighted in my works, which is the question of the interactions between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Well, there is no Neanderthal around anymore, but there is a lot of Homo sapiens. And so the question is how this happened a bit more than 40,000 years ago. Homo sapiens is a very abundant species. There are 8 billion of them on Earth, and I think you all have a rather clear idea of what is an Homo sapiens. It's in fact a rather, I would say, homogeneous species, although there is variation from one part of the world to another. But these variations are rather minor. They are mostly related to variations around different local environments, also, adaptation to the resistance to different kind of pathogens, etc. But all in all the humans today are very similar, and this is related to the fact that we all share a very recent common ancestry. But this situation that looks to us kind of normal, one species of humans that colonize the whole planet, is not normal, in fact. And if we move back in time, not a long time ago, just about 50,000 years ago, you may think 50,000 years is a long period of time, but it's almost nothing compared to maybe 8 or 9 million years of evolution of hominins, our ancestors and relatives. So if we move back in time, we see a very different picture, a degree of diversity among these hominins that much higher than what we have today. This is a picture of a tree of different species that existed in the last million years. And you see there are many bars of different colors. There is only one bar that reached the top of the frame, and it's this orange bar that is our species. And you have many others that got extinct, many of them around 50,000 years ago. The brown and red bars that you see on the left are two groups of hominins. Some colleagues think they are not real species, but more like species in formation. That's something we can maybe discuss later. And they are the Neanderthals, of course, that are sort of pop stars of the paleoanthropology. And also a sister group that is known in Asia that's called the Denisovans, that has been discovered only in 2010 on paleogenetic evidence. And these Denisovans are the sister group of the Neanderthals. All these hominins are what I would call large brain hominins, because yes, they have big brains, but there are other hominins, and these blue bars on the right are late erectus or erectus related forms. What's really puzzling finally is that until very recently we had around hominins like this little creature that you see on the right side, that's an Homo floresiensis from Indonesia, that were very different from present-day humans. So we're not talking about the kind of diversity that we have today. We're talking about really different species of hominins or humans. So our species emerged in Africa, and there are many arguments to recognize the origin of Homo sapiens in Africa. This notion was mostly developed in the 1980s, although it's a very old idea. You know, Darwin has this idea that Africa was probably the place where humans appeared. And the arguments are, first of all, that we have the oldest forms of Homo sapiens in Africa. And Ralph mentioned that with my colleagues, we discovered and dated the oldest form of our species in Morocco. They are dated around 300,000 years ago. And there are also a lot of genetic evidence of this African origin. To put it simply, if we look at the diversity of the genomes of present-day humans, there is a much greater diversity in Africa than anywhere else. And what we find out of Africa seems to be a subsample of what we have in Africa. So in other words, it's a branch that left Africa at some point and gave all the humans of today outside of Africa. So the story, and that could be almost the conclusion of my talk, is simple. You have the emergence of Homo sapiens in Africa, at least for the last 300,000 years, when in Eurasia you have Neanderthals in Western and Central Eurasia and Denisovans in the East. And you have this movement of populations out of Africa with a subsequent replacement of all the other archaic forms, in addition of sort of invading the territory of the Neanderthals or the territory of the Denisovans. Homo sapiens entered in places where they were never hominins before, like, for example, Australia, or the highest latitudes of Eurasia, and eventually entered also in America and colonized the whole planet. Allegedly, that's the most important event of human evolution in the last million years, and maybe it's the most important event in the whole human evolution. This change from a situation where we have a diversity of species of hominins to a situation where we have only one species that basically occupy all the planet and somehow took control of this planet. We would like to understand why and how this happened. And as a matter of fact, in most places in Eurasia, it's very difficult to address this question because we have archaeological and fossil evidence of the situation before 50,000 and sometime a long time before 50,000, and we have a picture of the present or the recent prehistory. But what has been going on really at the time of the replacement, we don't know. And probably Europe is the only place where we can really document with a lot of information what has been going on in this time period. And so in Europe, we have Neanderthals before Sapiens arrived, and these Neanderthals, they are very well documented. We have a lot of fossils. Here in this museum, you have the first specimen that has been identified formally as a Neanderthal, but since the middle of the 19th century, a lot of other specimens has been found. We know a lot of details about the evolution of the Neanderthal. It's a group that is documented in Europe at least as early as 400,000 years ago. So there is some changes a long time. We know a lot about the geography of the Neanderthals. You see that they are mostly represented in Europe, in Southwest Asia, but occasionally they extended their domain as far as the Altai, and we have sites in these regions where now we have Neanderthals. We know that not all the time, but sometimes they went there. And again, we have a lot of fossils. Actually, even before the Neanderthal from Feldhofer was found, there were already some fossils that has been unearthed in Europe, like, for example, this skull found in the cave of Forbes Quarry in Gibraltar, 1848, and even maybe 1830 in Belgium. We also have Neanderthals that have been found, but they were not identified as Neanderthals. And so we have quite a number of fossils. They are well preserved, and we can address a lot of questions regarding that. And also we have a lot of archaeology related to the Neanderthals and to the Sapiens in Europe. So I'm not going to develop much about the out of Africa movement. This out of Africa movement is sometimes described like a migration of Homo sapiens out of Africa. Actually, I think it's a kind of misleading term, because what we see is that this expansion of Homo sapiens at the gate of Africa, like for example in the Levant, seems to be mostly related to environmental changes. From time to time there are episodes when the Sahara and Arabian Peninsula become less desertic. It's called Green Sahara episodes. And so the hunter-gatherers living in Africa in this time period exploit this environment of savanna, and if this environment extended in the Near East, they disperse sort of passively in these regions without, I would say, deciding to migrate anywhere. And so we have traces of this presence of sapiens in the Levant as early as 180,000 years ago in the fossil record. This is one specimen that has been found in a cave called Misliya in Israel. But there is also a strong suspicion that there was older presence of sapiens in Southwest Asia, mostly evidenced by paleogenetics. We have evidence that in the Neanderthal genome that we know how to sequence today, we do find traces of contacts with African population, maybe as early as 300,000 years ago, this date when we have the earliest sapiens in Africa. So, for example, the Y chromosome or the mitochondrial DNA of the later Neanderthals seems to be of African origin. So it has been introgressed, to use a rather difficult term, into the genome of the Neanderthals from African population. I used the term replacement already several times, and I think that's the most simple way to represent what happened. But it's not a complete replacement. As I told you, nowadays we know how to sequence the genome of fossils, and especially of Neanderthals. So we have a good knowledge of the Neanderthal genome that has been sequenced in some individuals. And what has been discovered is that in present-day humans living out of Africa, we do find traces of Neanderthal genome. What you see here is the chromosomes of a human living out of Africa. And on this chromosome, you see these red bars. And these red bars are traces of Neanderthal DNA that can be found in present-day individuals. But what's important to underline about this picture is that, well, it's very crude, but first of all, nobody has this much Neanderthal DNA in the genome. This is an addition of everything that has been found in individuals today. So in average, we have about 2% of Neanderthal DNA in our genome. And if you put all the 2% of everybody, you have something like that. So that's a sort of compilation of all these integrations. And you see that there is a lot of places in our genome where you never find Neanderthal DNA. So in other words, if we add the 2% of everybody, in theory, because everybody has his own, I would say, Neanderthal contribution, so we could expect by adding all these small contributions to have a complete representation of the Neanderthal DNA, but it's not true. If you add all these 2%, you get about 40%, something like that, of the Neanderthal DNA, which means that in the genome of present-day humans, they are what paleogeneticists called Neanderthal deserts. You know, these blue parts where you never have Neanderthal DNA. And the explanation that we have for that is that natural selection sort of cleaned our genome from this presence in places where it was not good to have this DNA, this Neanderthal DNA. So in other words, there are some places in our genome where the coexistence of Neanderthal DNA and Homo sapiens DNA leads to problems for the individuals. And so, voila, that's the result. So for a long time, the picture we had of this occurrence of Homo sapiens in Europe was something like that. This is a picture that I took from a paper from 2014. So it's not so old, it's just 10 years ago. It has been made by two geneticists. And this was the idea, is that the idea was that there was a sort of wave coming from somewhere in the Levant, and this wave is the darker gray area would expand gradually north, and then northwest, and then west, and finally would replace completely the Neanderthals. The numbers that you see are numbers of generation. And so this was more or less connected to what we see in the archaeological record, because we have, at the time of these events, we have a big sea change in the European archaeological sites. We start seeing lithic assemblages like this one, what we call the Upper Paleolithic, and at the beginning of the Upper Paleolithic you have a complex of toolkits that we call the origination, and the origination is made of tools like this, a lot of blades and bladlets, a lot of points. What's important is that all these stone tools are very sort of stereotyped in their production, and this is in sharp contrast with what we had before in what we call the Middle Paleolithic, that was associated to the Neanderthals, with very few really stereotyped objects like this nice triangular index that you see on the left, but most of the Middle Paleolithic, so-called Mousterian, Micoquien, all sorts of names have been given to these assemblages, is made of flakes like the one on the right, the ones on the right side. And Paleolithic archaeologists have created the whole terminology and typology about the tools, I mean the retouched flakes that are found in these archaeological sites. I'm not sure that this typology meant something to the Neanderthals. It looks like they have been using cutting edges of flakes to do different things that they had to do. And yes, that resulted in forms, but is kind of different from what we have later. So that was I would say, the common wisdom. And if you look at the papers that were published until 10 years ago, this origination was taken as a proxy for the wave, the gray wave that I showed you of the Homo sapiens arrival in Europe. In fact, the reality was a little bit more complex, because in some sites in Europe, in some archaeological sites, in the stratigraphy under the origination and above the Mousterian or the Middle Paleolithic, you had assemblages that nobody really knew how to interpret. They were called transitional assemblages, because they seem, for some of them, to display intermediate features between the Middle and the Upper Paleolithic. And of course, this was kind of problematic, because it did not match the picture of a replacement. It matched the picture of a local evolution. And so people have been trying to find an explanation for these transitional assemblages. Here you have a map showing different spot of colors representing some of these assemblages. I must say that these so-called transitional assemblages are not so abundant, in fact. In many sites they are invisible. In some sites they are present, but with little, a limited number of artifacts. And all in all, it looks like these assemblages did not last for a long time. We're talking about, a couple of thousand years. And so it's a different picture of what we had before and after. So it looks like it's a sort of, for a couple of millennia, there was a rather complex situation in Europe. So in one of these assemblages, that is called Schaaffhausen, that has been discovered in central France and northern Spain, in at least 2 sites, actually 3 sites, we have human remains that has been identified, and these human remains were Neanderthal in their morphology, in their anatomy. And of course, this was a bit puzzling, and still today is puzzling, because some of these so-called transitional assemblages, and especially the Schaaffhausen, look pretty much like Upper Paleolithic sometimes. In the Schaaffhausen, you have, for example, body ornaments or bone tools like what you have here, or bladdlets. That's really the kind of things you expect more in association with Homo sapiens than with Neanderthals. There is still today a lot of discussion about whether or not these Neanderthal remains that are found in Schaaffhausen context are truly associated to the Schaaffhausen. And some people discuss whether the Neanderthals were the makers of the Schaaffhausen. But I must say that whoever met the Schaaffhausen, Neanderthals or Sapiens, what is clear is that in these sites we have Neanderthal remains that have been directly dated by radiocarbon, and that produce dates that fit into the time range of the Schaaffhausen, and also that some of them have yielded DNA that leaves no doubt about their Neanderthal nature. So in other words, what I'm telling you is that whoever met the Schaaffhausen, there was Neanderthals around at the time Schaaffhausen was produced. So this led to the idea that this so-called transitional assemblage was made by late Neanderthals, either because they sort of invented their own Upper Paleolithic, or because they were influenced by the presence of Homo sapiens in Europe at this time. And this model of transitional assemblages has been made by Neanderthals, has been applied to other assemblages than the Schaaffhausen. Like, for example, a kind of stone tool kit that is found in northwestern Europe that we call, sorry for the long name, but Lincolnian, Ranician, Germanovician. People prefer to use the term LRG in general. And again, the story about the LRG was, for some people, it was likely made by last Neanderthal who have made some kind of, have been able to produce some kind of more complex technologies than in the Middle Paleolithic. And it was supported in particular with dates that has been obtained on Neanderthal remains from a site in Belgium where there is LRG. And this site is the site of Spee, which actually is one of the sites where in the 19th century one of the most spectacular discoveries of Neanderthals occurred. We don't know really where in the stratigraphy the Neanderthals from Spee come from, but in 2010 there was a publication with dates that would again fit this transition period of in Europe. The problem is today that these dates have been re-examined, and it's quite clear that the first dates that has been produced were dates that were underestimated by the contamination, basically, of these bones. So today we have dates that are much older than that. Another example is a techno-complex, a lithic assemblage that we have in Italy and Greece that we call the Uluzian. And the Uluzian also look a little bit like, you know, the Chateaubriand with the stone, with bone tools and some body ornaments made of shells. And in the meantime, some stone artifacts that some people would sort of connect with the local Mousterian. So there was this general notion of, again, of transitional assemblages being made by Neanderthals. So the things started to change with the discovery in the collections of teeth coming from one site in southern Italy called Grotta del Cavallo, where deciduous teeth, meal teeth, were found in a layer which was supposed to be Uluzian, and these teeth were, in morphology, they were like the teeth of present-day Homo sapiens almost. And so that started to raise questions about this notion of the Uluzian being made by Neanderthals. Since then, there were other discoveries of this kind, and today more and more, I think people are convinced that, in fact, the Uluzian was made by Homo sapiens and not by Neanderthals. Last but not least, there is an assemblage that is found in the Levant and in Eastern Europe that some have called initial apoptotic. And again, it's one of these assemblage with one of these assemblages with mixed features. We find in these sites, we find elongated points looking like what people call Levallois points associated with the Middle Paleolithic, and they evolved to something looking like the blades we find in the Upper Paleolithic. And there was some suspicion already about these stone tools that they could represent a proxy for the expansion of the first Homo sapiens from the Levant into Eastern Europe. And the problem, again, is that we did not have much human remains in this initial apoptotic site. So there was a lot of speculation about that. And it led me to try to put my hands on the human remains that has been described in one site in Bulgaria called Bachokiro. And unfortunately, I could not locate this these human remains, or very fragmentary, and small pieces of bone and some isolated teeth. And so I had the opportunity with colleagues from Bulgaria to resume an excavation in this site. Initially, we thought maybe the site has been completely exhausted by earlier excavation, but actually there was archaeological layers still present in the site. And this is the kind of stratigraphy that you find in the Bachokiro cave. You have these yellow-gray sediments that are almost sterile, but at the bottom of the site, there is this very rich dark layer. It's dark because there is a lot of organic material in the sediments, and there is a very intense human occupation. And so underlying this almost sterile stratigraphy, there is a layer where you find thousands of objects, artifacts, bones, little pieces of related to human activity in a single square meter. So you have many, many of them. And there is this kind of stone tools associated to this human presence, very dense human presence, and it's what we call this initial anthropoetic. So you see it's very elongated points or big blades that has been produced in quantities and broken to make tools after. And luckily, during our excavation, we did find human remains. And this was, of course, a very exciting discovery. This is a maxilla that has been found in Bachukiro, in this layer. And without entering too much, too many details, this maxilla is like your maxilla. So it's a maxilla of Sapiens, completely modern in its morphology. And so there is no discussion about the fact that this is not Neanderthal. And so, of course, the conclusion was that this initial anthropoetic that was a bit mysterious has been made, at least in this part of the world, by Sapiens moving into Europe. In addition of this specimen, we found others, and we found others using a method which is a molecular technique that we use more and more extensively to locate small pieces of bones that are human in assemblages like this one. So what you see here, all these fragments of bones, is the kind of things that you find in archaeological sites of this time period. So in other words, 70% or sometimes more of the bones coming out of an archaeological site are fragments like that are impossible to identify, to assign to a given species based on the morphology, because basically they have no morphological information. But with a technique that has been developed by colleagues at the University of York, it's possible to, from pieces like that, to extract very small samples that are big like a rice grain or even smaller, and to treat them with some chemicals and to extract this chain of collagen that are preserved in some of these bones. And this chain of collagen, so collagen is a protein made by a series of amino acids that are aligned one after the other. So you can use chemical scissors, enzymes, to cut this chain and to produce pieces of protein that we call peptides. And then these peptides, they are measured, their mass is measured by a spectrometer, and you can get spectra, like what you have here at the bottom. And these spectra, they are typical from a given species or at least a genus of mammals. And so at the end of the day, starting with hundreds or even thousands of these pieces, you can produce a list of species or genera that are presented in the site. So horses, reindeers, bears, all sorts of creatures. And when you do that, if you do it on a large quantity of fragments, from time to time, you find something that's a human. And it's a human that was invisible until you use this technique. And of course, these are not specimens that you want to put in the showcase of a museum, but they are extremely interesting because you can date them directly, you can extract DNA, and you can do all sorts of studies, even if they look like little poor things. And so we did find humans this way in Bachukiro. And by the way, it's a technique that we have now developing in other sites. And I think this is probably the way to resolve the scarcity of human remains in all these assemblages. So in Bachukiro, the big surprise was first that we knew that initial anthropology was made by Homo sapiens, and even rather recent Homo sapiens. But then, when we directly dated these remains, we found dates. The dates are at the bottom of the frame. Dates that are between 43 and 45,000 years ago. And these dates are older than the origination. So basically, these demonstrate that the origination was not the start of the presence of sapiens in the middle latitudes of Eurasia, but there was among these so-called transitional assemblages, like the Ludian, like the assemblage from Bachukiro, we had already assemblages made by some groups of Homo sapiens. And the other things to underline about these dates is that these dates obtained on Homo sapiens from Bulgaria, associated to initial anthropology, are much older than the dates we have in Western Europe for the last Neanderthals. You know, these guys that are associated with the Chateaubriand deposits in some sites. And there is a discrepancy of several millennia between these two set of dates. So it means basically that 1,000 years before, millennia before Neanderthals disappeared in Western Europe, there was already the presence of some Homo sapiens in Eastern Europe. And as I said, it's also possible to extract DNA from these bones. These are, again, the representation of chromosomes from one of the specimens from Bachukiro. So there are many very important information that has been extracted from this DNA. First of all, yes, it's DNA of modern Homo sapiens, but it also shows that these people seems not to have contributed to the ancestry of present-day Europeans. So in other words, there are people coming from somewhere in the Near East, coming into Europe, but somehow it looks like they sort of disappeared or vanished in the Neanderthal world, or were replaced by later population like the origination Homo sapiens. The other thing that's really quite interesting is these blue bars that you see on the chromosome. So the blue bars that you see now are the red bars that you saw on the other slide a while ago. So you see these little blue bars that are traces of Neanderthal DNA in the genome of this individual. So it's a bit more than the 2% that you find in present-day Europeans. And it's mostly the DNA that has been acquired after the contacts of between Homo sapiens moving out of Africa and Neanderthals that probably were somewhere on their way in Southwest Asia. But in addition of these little blue bars, you see that on chromosome 2 or chromosome 19, you have this big chunk of Neanderthal DNA. And this big chunk of Neanderthal DNA means that in addition of the DNA that has been acquired by the ancestor of this guy a couple of millennia before, locally they had another they witnessed another episode of hybridization with local Neanderthals. And we can even estimate when this took place, and it took place only maybe 5 to 7 generations before the time these people lived. So virtually we are dealing with people who have been in contact with Neanderthals. And last but not least, and I think this really is very was a surprise somehow. In these genomes, we already observe these Neanderthal deserts that I mentioned when I showed you the effect of the integration of Neanderthal DNA in our genome. So it means that in 5 generations, it was enough for natural selection to clean the genome of these people from the DNA that was, Neanderthal DNA that was a bit deleterious in their genome. So in other words, natural selection against the Neanderthal DNA in the genome of these early Homo sapiens have been, I would say, brutal. You know, so probably in the first, second generation after the hybridization, probably the people who got the wrong number is in the genetic lottery. They did not have offsprings, or maybe they even did not get born at all. You know. And the other thing is that now we have more and more pictures of the genetic variability of these early sapiens moving into Europe, and we see that there are very contrasting situations from one group to another. This woman is a woman of which the skull has been found in Moravia. It's unfortunately not associated to archaeology, but it is likely from the same time period than the Bachokiro people, maybe a little bit older even. And in contrast to what we have in Bachokiro, in Zlatikun, it seems like these people, they have no contact with the local Neanderthals. So you see different groups, different stories. And to complete that, I want to show you results of another excavation, another work that we did in another site where we have a so-called transitional assemblages. So I return to this Lincolnian, Ranisian, Germanovician, this LRG. You remember I told you that this is an assemblage that has been believed also to possibly to have been produced by late Neanderthals. It is difficult to find a site today where you can really study this kind of assemblages because most sites has been completely exhausted by excavation in the first half of the 20th century. But there is one site, which is the site that gave the name of Ranisian, the R of LRG, which is the site of Ranis in Germany, in Thuringia. And some years ago, with a bunch of colleagues, we undertook an excavation at the bottom of the castle of Ranis, and that was quite, I would say, a complicated project because Ranis cave is a collapsed cave, which means the roof of a cave basically accumulated in big blocks. And when I say big blocks, I mean blocks big like a car, you know. And these blocks, if you want to access the archaeological layers, you have to go through all these blocks. And actually, the site was excavated in the 30s by a German archaeologist called Hüller. And the team of Hüller, they did a kind of mining to access the archaeological site. They made a shaft and then horizontal galleries, like mine galleries, to excavate the site. And well, actually, we had to do something like that also. So these blue things that you see at the bottom of the, I mean, and in the middle of the photo are helmets of people. And these people are at the bottom of a shaft that's about 8 meters deep. And no need to say that there was a lot of logistics to be able to conduct this excavation. It's a sort of miracle that by conducting a project like that and excavating a very small surface, you see at the bottom of the shaft, there is just a very, you know, it's a very small surface that is excavated. But doing this, we manage again, using the techniques that I already explained, you know, this molecular technique, what we call zooms, zooarchaeology by mass spectrometry, we have been able to find hominins fragments in this excavation. And in parallel, we conducted a research on the collections that has been left by Hublin in the Halle Museum. And a bunch of fragments of bones. And we also have been able to identify some fragments by their morphology. And all in all, we had about a dozen of human fragments that has been identified in Ranis and that can be connected to this LRG assemblage. So after more than a century of excavations of different sites of LRG and nobody being able to find any piece of hominin, we ended having a whole series of these fragments. I cannot tell you a lot of details about these fragments, especially regarding their genetics, because there is a paper that's going to come rather soon about the analysis of their nuclear genome, their chromosomes, and you'll see when it comes very soon that it's kind of exciting. But I can tell you a few words about what has been already published earlier this year, and it's about a part of the genome that we call the mitochondrial DNA. And it's a part of our genome that is transmitted only by females to their descendants, is a very simple part of our DNA. And this has been already analyzed and published. And once more, we can prove these guys are Homo sapiens. They are not Neanderthals. So again, we have another case of transitional assemblage that is not made by Neanderthals, but by Homo sapiens. And the other thing is that these people have a DNA that's different from what we have in Bachokiro. So, and by the way, that for some individuals is closer to what we have in Zlatikun. So again, we have this picture of small groups of sapiens moving into this part of Europe, but in a sort of independent way, one from the other. So it looks like there are small groups moving from the Near East, Southwest Asia somewhere, maybe a bit further north, and moving on very long distance to settle in northwestern Europe, at the periphery of the Neanderthal populations. And why I'm saying at the periphery, because again, when you try to look at the dating of these remains, you see that we are dealing with dates that are even older than in Bachokiro. In Ranis, we have dates for some of these fragments that go not only beyond 45,000, but some of them are even beyond 47,000. And so, again, we have Neanderthals further south, still about 40,000 years ago. So 7 millennia of chronological overlap between this occurrence of small group of sapiens in northwestern Europe and Neanderthals further south. And really we wonder what does that mean in terms of interaction between the two groups. And of course the question is what these guys are doing there, because for a long time, I mentioned already that why humans dispersed into Southwest Asia, the Levant, most likely initially for some kind of environmental reasons. But in this case, it's kind of counterintuitive to find the earliest Homo sapiens in Europe, not in the south, but in the north, you know. And people have sort of imagined for a long time that maybe modern Homo sapiens move into Western Europe because, you know, the occurrence of some kind of warmer phase. But this is not at all what we observe. And these are the results of a study that has been conducted by a colleague called Sara Pederzani. And Sara Pederzani, she studies isotope of oxygen in dental tissues, like this tooth that you see on the bottom left. It's a tooth of a horse. And the horses have teeth that grows continuously. So to produce a tooth like that, it takes a year and a half. And so you can sample the enamel along the tooth and measure the rate of stable isotopes of oxygen along the tooth through time. And we have models allowing us to reconstruct the temperature at the time when this tooth was growing in different months of the year. Because stable oxygen, isotope 18 of the oxygen varies in the environment depending on many things, but also depending on temperature. And so we have ways to reconstruct curves like the one you see here that gives you the variation of the temperature during the life of this horse. And it's very important because this horse is a horse that was brought in the site. Here it's Ranis. It has been brought in the site when humans were around, and even likely it has been brought by humans, in fact, in the site. And by studying this change in temperature, what Sara Pederzani showed is that at the time when people were in Ranis, the temperature was very cold. And actually, it went even colder and colder. And at some point in Ranis, the mean winter temperature was 12 degrees lower than the present day winter mean temperature. So I don't know if you spend often a night outdoor in Thuringia in the middle of winter, but try to imagine what it would be if the temperature would be 12 degrees colder. Actually, it's the kind of environment that you have today in northern Scandinavia. So it's a really cold environment. Basically, the landscape must have been a landscape with very few trees, if there were trees even. And in Bachukiro, we also have a rather, not as cold, but a rather cold environment. And so finally, the question is why these humans are there? Well, they are there maybe because Neanderthals are in the, I would say, the best place in Europe, and maybe because these small groups of sapiens are more sort of resilient or best at adapting to this kind of extreme environment, that they sort of settle by small groups at the periphery of the Neanderthal world, and eventually the Neanderthal will disappear and sapiens are going to be present everywhere. So the conclusions of all that is that, of course, modern Homo sapiens were present in Western Europe, in northwestern Europe, at least 47,000 years ago. What we call initial upper Paleolithic, LRG, all this stuff has been made not by late Neanderthals, but by early Homo sapiens. It's mostly also true for other assemblages of this time period. I mentioned the Uludian. There is another one that I did not mention called Boinician in the Czech Republic. And so the question is, in fact, did so-called transitional assemblages ever existed? Because the concept of transitional assemblages was a local evolution of the last Neanderthals producing something new. But now what we see is that most of these assemblages has been in fact imported into Europe by sapiens moving into the world of the Neanderthals. And their transitional pattern is related to the fact that Homo sapiens also produced some kind of middle Paleolithic, something we call Middle Stone Age in Africa, and somehow is not inconceivable that initial anthropologic, for example, display this kind of mixed features. As I said, all these events predate by several millennia the extinction of the last Neanderthals further south. And finally, this model that I showed of a wave of sapiens moving into Europe and replacing Neanderthals now is somehow falsified. And rather than a wave, what we have is a series of wavelets with small groups coming from very far, one after the other, and settling at the periphery of the Neanderthal world. This being said, eventually there is going to be a real wave, that is the origination wave, and these origination are going to replace everybody, in fact, the Neanderthals and this pioneer population. There are still questions that are to be resolved and a lot of work ahead of us to do. There is something in southeastern France, that lithic assemblage that we call the Neronian, that has been found in some sites of the Rhone Valley, that is said to be maybe a local initial anthropologic that would be even older than everything I presented today, maybe 53,000. And there is one deciduous tooth that has been found in association with Neronian that is said to be Homo sapiens. So this Neronian could be even an older episode of this early penetration of small groups of sapiens, but I must say there are many pending issues about the Neronian, and not everybody agree with this scenario. And still, we have a stone in our shoes, and the stone in our shoes is the Schaaffhausen. You remember, is this assemblage with Neanderthal remains found in association with a rather, I would say, evolved industry that looks like an Upper Paleolithic. Recently, last year, this piece of bone was detected and published in the collection of bones coming from one of the Schaaffhausen layers from a site called Arcy-sur-Cure in France. And according to the first author of the paper, this little piece of bone is the pelvis of a baby, a neonate, and the morphology of this pelvis is more like a pelvis of a modern baby than a pelvis of Neanderthal. So in the middle of all these teeth and bone fragments of Neanderthals, we have at least one piece of something that looks like a modern baby. So maybe eventually we'll find that the Schaaffhausen might have been produced maybe by a mixed population or something like that, but at the moment this is to be demonstrated. And finally, I would like to say that still there are questions about the interactions between Neanderthals and the last Neanderthals, these early sapiens. These are two covers of Nature displaying one body ornaments that has been found in a Schaaffhausen site in France, and the other one body ornaments that have been produced by the people in Bachokiro, these initial anthropologic people. I think it's very difficult to conceive that these kind of objects could appear about at the same time in Europe, completely independently in the Neanderthal world and in the Sapiens world. I think it's very likely that there is some kind of diffusion of these behaviors in Europe. Maybe the Schaaffhausen objects finally have been made by Sapiens and not by Neanderthals, but if they have been really made by Neanderthals, I doubt that there is no influence from the Sapiens that are nearby. Remind you that LRG is represented in Germany, but also in Belgium, you know, and in these sites from Belgium, they are just a couple of 100 kilometers away from the Chateaubriand sites where we have these kind of objects. Of course, I did not do all this alone, and this is the long list of the many colleagues who participated in the works in Bachokiro and in Ranis, and I'm very grateful to all of them for their contribution to this research, which I think really changed the way we see this transitional period in Europe. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jean-Jacques. And I see that the human story is thrilling, still thrilling, and I hope it will last for decades.
Well, we are still exploring other assemblages. I recently got a grant to apply this Zooms technique, this molecular technique, on a whole set of sites, other Chateaubriand sites and other sites of this time period. And well, actually, we start detecting other human remains.
Human remains are still present in our excavation from the Neanderthal Valley. We found roughly 50 fragments, which are now in your institute for screening and so on, and working with Mattea on it. But before we start into questions, I have the honor to present Jean-Jacques Hublin, a little Ice Age art object. This is a small bird carved of reindeer antler, found in the excavation of Hermann Schaaffhausen, 1883 in Andernach. It was ever first recognized Ice Age object in Germany. It's a copy which is not available in the shop, only available for the speakers of Schaaffhausen lecture. And I think you have a lot of things already in your office, but I hope it will find a nice place.
That's a beautiful object.
Yeah, it's
very nice.
The first ever recognized, and it's a hole, and you can place it on a stick. That remembers me on the scene with a bison and a bird on a stick in Le Puy in Lascaux. That's right.
Yes, there is a bird on a stick.
And
beautiful. Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be one of those fortunate owners of this.
It's our pleasure to have you here. It was a wonderful talk. And now I hear we have still no questions from the chat. No question from the chat. That is remarkable, but we have the opportunity to have questions here. And as it's a normal thing, I'm blinded by the light at any Schaaffhausen lecture. Soner Ucha.
Hello. Good evening, Mr. Hublin. I would like to talk about the future, actually. You told us that we have 2% of Neanderthal in our genome. I would like to know if in the further generations the percentage of Neanderthal will decline, or will it rest the same percentage? Romain.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. As I mentioned in my talk, probably rather quickly after the integration of Neanderthal genetic material in our genome, there was a sort of cleaning by natural selection, and we ended having very quickly individuals having 2-3%, no more. What has been going on along the many generations between us and people living 40,000 years ago or more is that this contribution of the Neanderthal genome got fragmented more and more in our genome, because at each reproduction, each generation there is a sort of reshuffling of the composition of our chromosomes. So these fragments, they get smaller and smaller, but still we can detect them. And actually I mentioned that the length of these fragments allow us to establish when these events occurred. So now why natural selection did not eliminate completely the Neanderthal genome from our chromosomes? Basically for two reasons. One reason is that some of these pieces of DNA are sort of beneficial to us. And they are beneficial, why? If we look at the effect of the presence of this Neanderthal DNA, we see that, for example, it's very often a piece of DNA that are connected to some kind of environmental adaptation, pigmentation, things like that, but also mostly because of immunity. And it's easy to understand. If you have a population migrating in a given area, and it comes from far, from Africa, for example, these people, they are not going to have any resistance to local pathogens. If they hybridize with local people who are already protected against these pathogens, they are going to basically save this part of the genome in their own genome. And so this is positive selection opposed to this negative selection that erased large portion of Neanderthal DNA in our genome. But the other reason why you could have Neanderthal DNA in your genome is because some parts of the DNA basically are not exposed to selection. They are sort of neutral. They have no effect. And there is part of our genome that, some people argue that there is junk DNA in our genome. And so if you inherited from pieces of Neanderthal DNA that is junk DNA, it's like a spot on an old T-shirt. You wash it again and again, and you still have a trace of an accident that happened in the past, but there is no reason why it would disappear.
Thank you.
But nevertheless, I'm very happy that at least 2% in any person in the room is still Neanderthal, and roughly 40–45% of Neanderthals in general have survived. Because I really love this Ice Age hunters.
But of course the question, and my colleagues paleogeneticists don't really like to answer this question, is in the 2% that you have, that I have, what is the proportion that really matters somehow in terms of phenotypic effect? Maybe not much. Maybe not much. So it says something about what happened. It's interesting from the point of view of evolution and natural selection, but maybe not much. And if I can add something to this question, really something one has to keep in mind is that there are no good genes and bad genes. I mean, there are pieces of DNA that are advantageous or disadvantageous depending on the condition of the environment, of many other aspects of our biology and behavior. And so, in other words, something that has been positively selected in the past can be, at some point in the future, not so positive and be eliminated by natural selection, or vice versa.
I hear we still have no questions from the chat, but some annotations that the talk was very interesting and very informative, but perhaps the colleagues in Tübingen are shocked and will not send some questions. Further questions?
Thank you very much for the very interesting talk. My question was also on genetics. You talked about introgression, and you showed that you have highly conserved human sapiens aspects. It was mainly on chromosome 1, I remind. And these deserts, do you know what they are coding for? Are they specific where you can have a difference aspects that's typical human sapiens or typical or something that differentiates from Neanderthals? And you have had also some remarks about integration of sapiens material into Neanderthals. Do you have some integration also in these desert areas? And might that be some hint that it destabilizes the Neanderthals, or is the or don't you have enough data on that?
Du warst so oft hier, Ursel, du bist vorbelastet, man merkt. She's a frequent part of this lecture.
I'm going
to
answer the second or third or fourth question first, and then come back to the first one. I expect that we should have Neanderthals with integration of sapiens DNA into their genome. But first of all, we don't really know what happened and how you explain this integration. And you can, if you have pink glasses, you can imagine some kind of love stories between Neanderthals and sapiens. But there are scenarios that are much less sweet to explain why there is this integration. But the main problem that we face is that there are many sapiens around, 8 billion, and so you can analyze the genome of many people and try to detect Neanderthal DNA. Unfortunately, we don't have thousands of Neanderthals in the fossil record, and in order to find integration of sapiens DNA in Neanderthals, you need to find Neanderthals post-contact, of course, because before contact, and most of the Neanderthals we have in the fossil record, they are before contact, maybe all the Neanderthals we have. And so this is probably why, so far, we don't have any evidence of this other integration. Now, what you are asking, the question you're asking is really interesting, because these deserts of Neanderthal DNA, they are not anywhere. They are in specific places in the genome. I'm going to give you one example that I found really striking. There is a gene that's called FOXP2 that's been much discussed because it's related to language production, among other things. And basically, people who have people who have a mutation of this gene have problems producing a language. And this gene has been sequenced in Neanderthals and in sapiens, and we know that Neanderthals have exactly the same version of the gene that we have. And so people said, wow, it means, Neanderthals are just like us for that. But the fact is that around FOXP2 in our genome, this is where there is the largest desert of Neanderthal DNA. And what's around the gene is what basically controls the expression of the gene. So it's not so much the genes, but also the control of the expression of the genes. And so here we have something different between us and Neanderthals. The other thing we can look at is the presence of the expression of Neanderthal genome in different tissues of the body. And we find that there are two organs where the expression of Neanderthal DNA is weaker. So the first one is the brain. And so it looks like for the brain development, it's better to have Homo sapiens DNA than Neanderthal DNA. There is another organ that's quite interesting, which is the testes, the testicles. This is where Neanderthal DNA is not very expressed. And one of the possible explanations, and there are other arguments for that, is that the hybrids, the male hybrids of Neanderthals and sapiens had a limited fecundity, or even maybe were sterile. Like this is observed when you have a species on the verge of separation. There is also little Neanderthal DNA on the X chromosome, and that's also what you observe when you have this process. I mean, this process of separation with male hybrids being less fertile or even sterile.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So first of all, thanks for this very nice talk. And my question is simple. So recently, did we make any progress in understanding why Neanderthal disappeared?
Well, my answer would be because of us. Okay. And there is a whole literature about, you know, Neanderthal extinction, and people argued that maybe it related to the climate, to environmental conditions, to endogamy, to, you know, cosmic rays, to volcanic eruption. Okay, you know, there are many papers of this kind. Well, you know, the problem with all this explanation is that Neanderthal, they did very well for, you know, at least 300,000 years, 350,000 years. And so, yes, their population contracted sometime because of climatic condition, but then they re-expanded, etc. And when another actor was on the scene, they did not re-expand. And actually, what we see after, say, 50,000, so not before, but after 50,000, what we see is that everywhere where our own species went, local people disappeared. So it's not just the Neanderthal extinction, it's the Denisovan extinction, it's the Homo floresiensis extinction, it's extinction of everything but us. So I think we should try to identify what's wrong with us. You know, what is the feature of Sapiens that lead others to extinction, rather than to try to find out why locally this group or that other one disappeared.
But do you think it's competition for resources or just extermination, basically?
No, I think it's, you know, I often give this example of invasive species. You know, you take a crawfish from Louisiana, you put it in a river in southwestern France, and you come back 50 years later, and the local crawfish have disappeared. Why? Because these species that you introduce there have a better reproductive success, is more tolerant to pollution, is more aggressive, is more this, is more that. And so you have the accumulation of all these little differences that makes one species being replaced by another. And I would say there's probably not a single simple explanation. It's a mixed, you know, probably somehow sapiens were, you know, more efficient in exploiting the environment. There are also issues about energy consumption, metabolism, that in general sapiens are more, less expensive organism than Neanderthals. There are issues about, you know, reproduction, the offspring, all sorts of things like that, and probably it's a combination of everything. But again, what I would also underline is that if there was some kind of superiority of sapiens or Neanderthals, it's something that developed only late in the evolution of these groups. As I said, probably mostly around 50,000, not before. And still, this difference was not overwhelming because we don't have a sort of rapid replacement of one group by another. I remind you, the whole process lasted several millennia, which, you know, it's a very long time for humans.
I think that was very good from the word. I have to close the lesson, and there are no questions from the chat. But very important is, I switch to German. abonniert alle den YouTube-Channel des Rheinischen Landesmuseums. The channel is very informative. Of course, we have stored also
earlier lessons from scientists all over the world. And thank you very much to the auditory. Thank you, special thanks to Jean-Jacques Hublin. Kommen Sie alle gut nach Hause und Ihnen allen eine gesegnete Weihnachtszeit.
Thank you.